So this game called Code Violet came out. Not all that interesting. Didn't know it existed. Wasn't following it. It's some PS5 exclusive that exists. I never heard about it until like DSP started playing it and said it was like completely unfinished and broken. I didn't really pay any attention to this at all. And honestly, I probably should have, because this is a very transparent example of just how corrupt video game journalism actually is, because a lot of the reviews for Code Violet were very, very positive. They were very, very glowing. They were promoting this game. They were saying it was like this really good game. And now, considering the game is literally unfinished, like, you're seeing a bit of a scrub job. I'm looking at the Metacritic page right now, and they removed a lot of their reviews because that they were so obviously like disparate from the actual player experience. That like players were getting like this unfinished broken mess while game journals were singing its praises. Like, we've seen this before with games like Cyberpunk 2077, right? Completely awful, horrible, off-the-wall games with no redeeming value whatsoever. But, like, seeing it with, like, a relatively, like, unknown game from, like, some developer, it's interesting, especially when you consider this is a PlayStation 5 exclusive. And I do think this is a very transparent example of just how biased the game journalism industry is towards PlayStation, how they'll bend over backwards for them, how they'll say all their games are masterpieces and the best ever made, even when they're straight up unfinished. And in this day and age, you're seeing more and more people start to notice the pattern and start to call it out. And unfortunately, a lot of people seem to chalk it up to, like, corruption in, like, woke culture and, like, game journalists protecting their own and stuff like that, when it's actually more accurate to say that, like, PlayStation exclusives are just worshipped simply by virtue of being PlayStation exclusives. Like, that's the reality of what's happening, is that the entire gaming industry has this vested interest in, like, promoting Sony while downplaying Xbox, and especially Nintendo, because Sony has a stranglehold on the video game journalism industry and controls these people outright, I've been saying this for a long time, and I haven't really talked about it in recent years because, Sony is a company that's on freefall, right? Their golden goose, like The Last of Us, Naughty Dog, has completely collapsed. And they have, like, some semblance of, like, control over the industry, like, all the awards that The Last of Us HBO has been getting and stuff like that. There are still, like, things like that are happening that I have talked about, but by and large, like, the company has not had any real, genuine influence over the industry in the past 10 years, right? They have not been able to compete with Nintendo. Like, it really does feel like Breath of the Wild and the Switch were kind of the beginning of the end for them, because it was no longer possible to gaslight people into thinking Nintendo just wasn't capable of putting out, like, major AAA games. That they were lesser than PlayStation and Xbox games. It's that's what we're seeing a lot of right now, is that people are starting to see through the nonsense that game journals have been propping up for the past 25 years. And it's leading to some really interesting scenarios where, I'm seeing more and more people start to question, Metal Gear Solid's relevancy as an IP. People are questioning Final Fantasy VII. People are talking about how the remake exclusivity deal was a mistake. Like, more and more people are starting to notice, like, the fact that PlayStation is not what it was hyped up to be. PlayStation was sold to us as kids as the definitive video game platform that was way better and cooler and more mature than Nintendo. But in actuality, Nintendo has been, like, putting out banger title year after year, while PlayStation just struggles to keep up. PlayStation was always reliant on this idea that it was for adults and it was for serious gamers, and that strategy didn't pan out well, especially when their core audience started having kids. So, with that being said, what can we expect from here? What are we going to see next from the PlayStation Nation? It's going to be the same thing we've always seen, right? 2024 gave us Astrobot as Game of the Year. Left no cultural impact. Nobody talks about it. Nobody remembers it. Another blatant example of Sony corruption, right? And it feels like more and more that this kind of strategy, this kind of behavior, this kind of like shilling, it doesn't pan out very well at all, because every time they try it, the game either goes completely unnoticed because nobody pays attention to game journals anymore, or it does get noticed and people start clowning on them for the wrong reasons. So Code Violet is a very good example of this, because this was a game that they tried to hype up, and then it turned out to be completely broken, and then they had to backtrack on it and like pull back. But like, the more they do this kind of thing, the more people are going to notice like the general pattern. How PlayStation is literally pumping out titles that do not work, while Nintendo is putting out bangers like Kirby Air Riders and Pokemon Legends ZA. You know, when they're putting out games like Metroid Prime 4, you know, like PlayStation just can't compete with any of that. And we're seeing that more and more often with every release, major release from PlayStation. You know, a couple of years back it was Concord, you know, PlayStation exclusive. You know, Game Journos tried to defend them, you know, and people tried to chalk it up to woke culture, but it actually was because of the PlayStation exclusivity. You know, we've seen this time and time and time again from the industry, and it really makes me wonder just how much longer this can go on. You know, how much longer people can still like viably pretend that PlayStation is some like genre-defining thing, when in actuality it's just a complete nothing burger that has contributed nothing of value to gaming, that isn't impressive in any way, shape, or form, that nobody cares about it, that nobody likes it, that nobody plays these games. And yeah, titles like this are a very good example of what a typical PlayStation product looks like. You know, it is broken, it is unfinished, it is lazy, it is like a disaster. You know, critics do try to push it, only to get rejected by audiences later on. This has been the general pattern of PlayStation exclusives since like forever. Like, this is their standard pattern. You know, you can trace this back to you know, even like something like, say, Sonic 06. Right, you know, that was supposed to be the big, like, Sonic game compared to Sonic and the Secret Rings. Like, it was supposed to be this industry-defining thing, you know, the big, glorious return to form for Sonic the Hedgehog, you know, the number 2 in gaming, and it just completely killed the IP, you know. That's what we've seen from Sonic over the past several years. You know, that's what we've seen from the industry over the past several years. That's what we, that's what we have experienced as gamers. And it's about time that we start openly rejecting PlayStation as a brand. You know, it's not enough to reject titles like Code Violet. We really have to go after titles like, you know, like Astrobot, like God of War Ragnarok, like The Last of Us Part 2. Like, until we start doing that, like, this is going to keep happening, and it is always, 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 always going to get worse.